Welcome to the Hunchcast, where we discuss all things the Hunchback of Notre Dame. I'm Leslie.
And I'm Patrick, and today we're discussing RKO's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, released in 1939, directed by William Dieterle, and starring Charles Laughton, Maureen O'Hara, Sir Cedric Hardwicke, and Edmund O'Brien.
Sir Cedric Hardwicke, so fancy. Patrick, a couple weeks ago we covered Universal's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which was released in 1923 and starring the man of a thousand faces, Lon Chaney. Am I correct in saying that RKO's Hunchback is a remake of Universal's Hunchback? How did that come to be?
RKO's adaptation is a remake of that Universal silent classic, but you wouldn't really know that by watching the movie because they're very, very different beasts. Universal tried remaking their 1923 version as soon as sound was invented. As early as 1931, the head of Universal Studios, Carl Laemmle, announced that the studio was going to remake Hunchback in sound and better than ever. Now, 1931 was also more or less the height of the Great Depression in the United States, when our economy was at its worst and 1 out of 4 people were unemployed.
Yeah, Universal's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the 1923 version, was one of the most expensive movies ever made at the time. What frickin' money did Universal have lying around at the height of the Great Depression to remake that movie, but, as Carl Laemmle said, on an even larger scale?
They got a bit of a windfall with new films in the horror genre like Dracula and Frankenstein, which both came out in 1931. And speaking of Frankenstein, Boris Karloff, a relatively unknown actor at the time, played the monster in that movie. And he was quickly announced to play Quasimodo.
That would have been awesome! I would have loved to see him as Quasimodo.
Personally, I think Karloff would have made a great Frollo. That menacing British voice that's both sweet and eerie. But off the success of Frankenstein, Universal thought, okay, who's the next ugly guy in makeup? It's Quasimodo. And there were attempts to get the ball rolling throughout the early 1930s. Universal would make a big announcement, we're doing the Hunchback remake. No. And in 1932, John Huston, yes, that John Huston, the guy who directed The Treasure of the Sierra Madre and The Maltese Falcon and a zillion other movies, he wrote a story treatment for a remake of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, as well as a few pages of a script, but that didn't get off the ground either. And throughout the early 30s, Universal is announcing and then quietly forgetting about remaking Hunchback. It was a turbulent time economically, and even though a lot of the sets from the 1923 version were still standing,
and would be standing until 1967 when they were destroyed in a fire,
it's very difficult to do Victor Hugo's novel justice on the cheap. You need all those extras, you need all those costumes. It needs to be an epic.
But that hasn't stopped some producers from making really cheap adaptations of The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Listener, I'm not going to reveal what adaptations I'm talking about. You're just going to have to wait until we cover them on this show.
And as Universal hemmed and hawed and waxed and waned with remaking the movie throughout the early 30s, they announced just about every actor who was in some kind of horror or supernatural movie to play Quasimodo. Aside from Boris Karloff, they announced Peter Lorre, Irving Peichel, everyone's favorite. But by 1936, Universal was in some big trouble, and not just because of the Great Depression. The studio had bet big on a movie version of Showboat, based on one of the most popular musicals ever made. Showboat was a huge production, a super jewel, if you will, which was Universal's term for one of their big budget epics when they could finally scrape around a couple of bucks to make something worth watching.
That's right, The Hunchback of Notre Dame was also a super jewel. That's Jewel, listener, not the other one. Leslie, you made that joke in the Universal's Hunchback episode. I know.
And even though the 1936 version of Showboat is pretty good, it's available from the Criterion Collection, it did not make enough money to satisfy Universal. And the founding family of Universal, the Laemmle family, gets ousted from the company that they started.
I used to rule the world. Seas would rise when I gave the word. Now it... Coldplay? Anybody? All right.
Universal, as they have this new leadership, they're trying to save some money and get themselves a bit more prestige. They are looking to get fast cash. So the rights to remake the 1923 Hunchback get sold off to another studio. That's easy money.
Wait, I'm confused. Victor Hugo's novel, Notre-Dame de Paris, or as we know it in the English-speaking world, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, was in the public domain. Why was any studio in Hollywood looking to buy the rights to make a movie they could make themselves for free?
I was confused about that too, but I've got a couple theories as to why. The first is that there are elements of that 1923 movie that are not in Victor Hugo's novel. So if somebody wanted to adapt elements from that movie specifically, you had to have the right to do so legally.
Like the idea of the character Claude Frollo from Victor Hugo's novel having a lot of his actions and personality traits given to a character named Jehan Frollo, which we're going to see in RKO's movie that we also saw in Universal's movie.
Likewise, by buying the remake rights, a studio is preventing the original studio from remaking that movie. So you're crushing the competition. You don't want too many Hunchback of Notre Dame movies out at once.
Like how there were 2 different film adaptations of the book Dangerous Liaisons released one right after the other within the same year. Well, one of us is gonna have to change.
So Universal sells the rights to their 1923 adaptation to MGM, which was probably the most prestigious studio in Hollywood throughout the 1930s, run by Louis B. Mayer. And as it happens, guess who was a bigwig at MGM in the late 1930s?
Yo mama?
Irving Thalberg.
I remember Irving Thalberg. He was the very young producer at Universal who had grown up chronically ill, spent a lot of his childhood sick in bed, unable to play outside, entertained himself by reading a ton of books, especially The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo, which he fell in love with. He grows up, he becomes a remarkably young producer at Universal, and when Lon Chaney approaches the studio and pitches a film adaptation of The Hunchback of Notre Dame with himself playing Quasimodo, Irving Thalberg gets so excited. Not only does he convince the studio to make the movie, but he convinces the studio to expand the film's budget. And while Universal's The Hunchback of Notre Dame was one of the most expensive films ever made at the time, that investment paid off because the film elevated Universal from a B-tier studio to a major player in the motion picture industry, and it made Lon Chaney an internationally recognized superstar. And I did know that, and we discussed this in our episode about Universal's Hunchback, Irving Thalberg left Universal to work at MGM before the movie was even completed. So he didn't really get to enjoy the fruits of his labor. But here he is at MGM in the mid-1930s, I guess, and oh, wouldn't you know, we just bought the rights to remake this movie that I produced.
So it all comes full circle.
Oh, how the turntables.
Well, MGM never bothers making the movie.
Cute.
After about a year or so, MGM is going to sell the rights for a cool profit for not even writing a script or really doing anything aside just sitting on the rights to remake Universal's movie. They sell it to RKO Radio Pictures.
Which no longer exists.
No, but in the 1930s, it was one of the major players. And RKO, unlike Universal and MGM, actually get the ball rolling on this remake. They get this movie in theaters in less than 2 years from buying the rights.
Nice.
They were able to work fast back then in Hollywood. This was the age of the so-called studio system, where the big movie studios had absolute control of every aspect of production, everything was in-house, and they knew how to do every aspect of making a movie to a complete science. But that doesn't mean the process of casting a movie is going to be very easy. You know, the studio found a director fairly quickly in William Dieterle, who had done a lot of respectable period dramas, such as The Life of Émile Zola, and he also did a lot of directing on A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is one of my favorite movies, even though it is incoherent.
Yeah, William Dieterle was German, and he was very influenced by the style of German expressionism, which you can definitely see in this version of The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
After Lon Chaney made the part of Quasimodo so prestigious after the 1923 movie, everybody and their mother wanted to play Quasimodo. It was a coveted role. Orson Welles was sought to play Quasimodo, and he was almost cast, but he only wanted to play Quasimodo if he could also direct the movie. And RKO thought that was too big of an ask, to be both the director and the star of the movie.
You want to have total creative control over this movie as the star and the director? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And then 2 years later, Orson Welles both directs and stars in a movie called Citizen Kane, which is still to this day considered one of the best movies ever made. LOL.
One of the other actors that really lobbies for the role is, of all people, Creighton Chaney.
Lon Chaney's son, who did not have a very good relationship with his father toward the end of his father's life.
But Creighton was really passionate about following his father's role. He wanted to honor his father, and he probably would have had his own interesting take on the character. Now, by 1939, Creighton was not a nobody. He was relatively well known on Broadway for his portrayal of Lenny in Of Mice and Men.
Was he going by the name Lon Chaney Jr. at that time, or was he still being billed as Creighton Chaney?
He was going by Lon Chaney Jr., which might have looked cute on a poster, like, oh, Junior's playing the same role as his dad. And whether or not he would have been a good Quasimodo, we'll never know, because Creighton is cast aside in favor of Charles Laughton.
Yes, listener, if you're unfamiliar with the name Charles Laughton, you are missing out. Please, please, please take a couple minutes, do some research into his life. He is, in my most humble of opinions, one of the best actors who ever walked this planet. He was in over 60 movies. By the time he played Quasimodo, he had already won an Academy Award for playing, of all people, King Henry VIII. And The Hunchback of Notre Dame was not Charles Laughton's only experience acting in a film adaptation of a Victor Hugo novel. Just 4 years before this movie came out, in 1935, he played Javert in a film adaptation of Les Miserables. But despite all of his success, Charles Laughton's life was not all peaches and cream. He was a closeted gay man living and working in Hollywood at a time when some studios, especially MGM, wrote moral turpitude clauses into their contracts, which said, hey, if we find out that you are engaging in any behavior that we deem morally reprehensible, such as carrying on a relationship with someone of the same sex, we will fire you, we will blacklist you, you will never work in Hollywood again. Which is why Charles Laughton was hesitant when Irving Thalberg, who was working for MGM, approached him and said, hey, I would really like you to play Quasimodo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame if MGM ever gets around to making their own film adaptation. So, extremely wealthy, successful actor. He's married to a beautiful actress named Elsa Lanchester, who is best known for playing the Bride of Frankenstein for Universal. He's got this gorgeous house overlooking the Pacific Coast Highway. His life is very shiny and pretty on the outside, but on the inside, he is unable to present his true self to the public. It's a very sad story, actually.
And it's not just that he was gay in a time when being gay was frowned upon. He was very self-loathing, and Laughton often thought poorly of his performances as an actor, and he thought poorest of all of his own appearance. He regarded himself as the epitome of physical ugliness, and once said that his face was so ugly it could stop a sundial. So Quasimodo is not just a role that he's doing for the money, and he was paid good money. He's doing it because he relates to Quasimodo and understands Quasimodo and that sort of self-loathing misery that only a character as wretched as he can really embody.
We could probably talk for hours about marginalized people's attraction to this story, particularly to characters like Quasimodo and Esmeralda, these outcasts existing on the margins of society looking in. I mean, the first person to compose an opera based on The Hunchback of Notre Dame was a disabled woman. The first person to direct a film adaptation of The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1905 was a woman. The producer who convinced Universal to make The Hunchback of Notre Dame and to give it the budget it deserves was a man who had grown up chronically ill, and now the man playing Quasimodo for RKO was a closeted, gay, overweight man. I think the story of The Hunchback of Notre Dame and the story of the fan community associated with The Hunchback of Notre Dame is one of seeing yourself and your insecurities reflected in the titular character, which we definitely see here with Mr. Laughton, who turns in a fantastic performance as Quasimodo, but we'll get to that in a bit.
Laughton saw himself in Quasimodo, and he saw one of his co-stars in an obscure British movie called Jamaica Inn in Esmeralda. Laughton was especially fond of a then 18-year-old actress from Ireland named Maureen O'Hara. She was just getting started, and Laughton really became her mentor and almost a father figure. He brought her over to America, had her cast as Esmeralda, and really advocated for her and supported her, not just through this movie, but throughout the rest of their life.
And clearly, he was not interested in her as a romantic partner or wasn't attracted to her. Again, he was a gay man, but they did have a very sweet father-daughter relationship for many, many years, even after the making of Hunchback.
But the making of Hunchback, while it was an efficient production of the Hollywood studio system, wasn't exactly the easiest. They filmed most of the movie in the late summer of 1939 in the San Fernando Valley in California.
It is hot, 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 baby.
It was a rough summer. You had these crowds of people sweating in these medieval costumes, poor Charles Laughton underneath, pounds of makeup. It was tough, and poor Maureen O'Hara, running around barefoot on those cobblestone streets, really got her feet messed up.
Oh, gosh. Poor girl.
This was a lavish production. The replica of Notre Dame, which, like the 1923 movie, technically only encompassed the first 20 or so feet of the cathedral. That's just for the facade, and various parts of the interiors and exteriors were built on studio sound stages. Cost $250,000. And the overall budget for the movie was $1.8, which was pretty huge back then.
And according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation calculator, $1.8 million in 1939 is $42.8 million today. So not near the budget of some of these uber expensive CGI wrought Marvel movies that are being pumped out today, but still up there in terms of budget.
Like the 1923 film, this version spared no expense. But unlike the 1923 film, this version spared no expense not just on the set, but on the talent. You had rather accomplished screenwriters, successful novelists and working journalists doing the script and the story scenario. You had a solid director in William Dieterle. You had big stars like Charles Laughton, Sir Cedric Hardwicke, Thomas Mitchell, who that year also starred as Scarlett O'Hara's father in Gone with the Wind.
Yeah, 1939 was a fantastic year for movies, which also means that it was a very hard year to get an Oscar nomination during. This was the year of Gone with the Wind. It was the year of The Wizard of Oz.
And at the very end of the year, December 1939, we get RKO's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. But what did moviegoers see when this movie finally came out, premiering at Radio City Music Hall on December 29th, 1939, Leslie?
I thought you'd never ask, Patrick. Our story takes place in Paris at the end of the 15th century. No specific year is given. The 100 Years' War is finally over, and with the benevolent King Louis XI in power, the people of France begin to dream of a future in which all people are treated equally. However, an obstacle stands in their way. the king's callous and prejudiced Chief Justice, Jehan Frollo, played by Cedric Hardwicke. Forgive me, Sir Cedric Hardwicke. Did not mean to disrespect you, Sir Hardwicke. I know you're listening, you're our biggest fan. Jehan and the king, played by Henry Davenport, visit a printing shop to see a revolutionary new invention called the printing press. While the king is excited about this new form of expression of thought, Jehan warns him that the smallest things are often the death of the greatest. Meanwhile, at the city gates, the beautiful Romani dancer Esmeralda, played by Maureen O'Hara, sneaks into the city. Esmeralda has come to Paris to request an audience with the king and implore him to grant the Romani equal rights. The Festival of Fools, which the king will be attending that day, is her perfect opportunity, and she makes her way to the city square and dances for the crowd. Her dance attracts the attention of several men, including the captain of the King's Guard, played by Alan Marshall, the progressive playwright Pierre Gringoire, played by Edmund O'Brien, Jehan Frollo, and the king himself, who tells Jehan, "Who cares about her race? She's pretty," which is a startlingly progressive line to come from a movie released the same year as Gone with the Frickin' Wind. Esmeralda notices someone staring at her from under the stage. The crowd recognizes the eyes of the bell ringer of Notre-Dame Cathedral, Quasimodo, or Quasimodo, as everyone in this movie calls him, played by Charles Laughton, and they force him out and crown him the King of Fools. The parade they throw in his honor is interrupted by Jehan, Quasimodo's adoptive father, who leads Quasimodo into the church. Back in the square, a pair of guards demand to see Esmeralda's city papers. Because she has no papers to show, she runs into Notre Dame and claims sanctuary. She is welcomed by the cathedral's archdeacon, played by Walter Hampton, who is also Jehan Frollo's older brother. While the other parishioners pray only for themselves, Esmeralda selflessly implores the Virgin Mary to lift her people out of oppression. Jehan confronts Esmeralda, calling her a heathen and a witch. The two strike up a conversation and find that they share a love for animals. Esmeralda acknowledges the goodness inside Jehan and takes this as a sign that the Mother of God will answer her prayer. The king, who has been praying nearby, overhears Esmeralda and tells her he will consider helping the Romani. Jehan leads Esmeralda to the bell tower to be looked after by Quasimodo, but after Esmeralda runs out of the cathedral in horror at Quasimodo's appearance, Jehan signals for him to chase after her and abduct her. The conflict wakes up Pierre Gringoire, who alerts the king's guards. While Quasimodo is arrested, the captain of the guard flirts with a smitten Esmeralda. He tells her his name is Phoebus and that he will see her again. Esmeralda is initiated into the Court of Miracles, the secret hideout where all Paris's outcasts take shelter. Pierre is chased into the court only moments later, and Clopin, the king of the Court of Miracles, played by Thomas Mitchell, sentences him to be hanged for trespassing unless one of the court's women takes him for a husband. Esmeralda offers to marry him to save his life. Once alone, Pierre recites a love poem to Esmeralda that includes the name Phoebus. Esmeralda reveals that she is in love with a man named Phoebus, and though Pierre is initially disappointed that Esmeralda doesn't reciprocate his feelings, he tells her he's willing to be anything she wants him to be: a husband, a brother, or a friend. The next day, Quasimodo is brought to trial. Because both Quasimodo and the presiding judge are deaf, Quasimodo is sentenced to be whipped because of a misunderstanding. Gringoire implores the archdeacon to stop Quasimodo's brutal punishment, but the archdeacon replies that he can't, saying, "If his punishment seems unjust, there is a higher power who watches and avenges. I wonder if that's foreshadowing." Quasimodo cries out for water on the pillory. Initially, he is ignored, including by Jehan Frollo himself, but eventually Esmeralda takes pity on him and gives him a drink. When the archdeacon asks Jehan what Quasimodo's crime was, Jehan lies to his brother and tells him Quasimodo pursued Esmeralda of his own accord. Sometime later, Esmeralda and Pierre are hired to perform at a party for the nobility. Both Jehan and Phoebus are in attendance. Jehan corners Esmeralda and confesses that he has become obsessed with her, saying, I want you for myself alone. If I can't have that, it will be my end and yours. Later that evening, Phoebus and Esmeralda meet in the garden for a romantic rendezvous. Esmeralda confesses her undying devotion to Phoebus, while Phoebus admits his affairs are only fleeting. Moments later, the partygoers hear a scream and rush into the garden to find Phoebus murdered and Esmeralda standing over his body holding a knife. Meanwhile, Jehan rushes to Notre-Dame and confesses to his brother that he has killed a man out of love for a woman who has bewitched him, and he begs his brother for help. The archdeacon disowns Jehan and says, "My duty is to help the girl, not you." Pierre visits Esmeralda in prison and promises he will work to free her. Esmeralda implores Pierre to look after her people when she's gone, and begs him to forgive her for meeting with Phoebus, saying, "Even before he was killed, I knew he didn't really love me." During Esmeralda's trial, Pierre's attempts to persuade Jehan of Esmeralda's innocence fail, and he is forcibly removed from the courtroom. Then, Quasimodo rushes in, and in an attempt to save Esmeralda, he says he murdered Captain Phoebus, but he is laughed out of the room. Esmeralda confesses to the murder under torture, but King Louis intervenes and proposes a different test. He blindfolds Esmeralda and lays the murder weapon on a table beside a different dagger. Esmeralda touches the murder weapon at random, which the king interprets as a sign of her guilt. Sure. On the day of her execution, the archdeacon tells Jehan he cannot allow an innocent woman to do public penance on holy ground, and Jehan replies, "Then she will hang without public penance." Just as the noose is tied around Esmeralda's neck, Quasimodo swoops down from the cathedral, grabs Esmeralda, and swings back up, crying, "Sanctuary!" Up in the bell tower, Esmeralda asks Quasimodo why he saved her, and he answers, "I tried to carry you off, and the next day you gave me a drink of water and a little pity." He says she must never leave the church or she will be hanged, and that would kill him. Jehan and a cohort of other nobles sign a handwritten petition imploring the king to do away with the law of sanctuary forever. Meanwhile, Pierre finishes his own petition to the king to pardon Esmeralda, and he brings it to the printing press to be copied en masse and distributed throughout the city by students and beggars. Sure enough, Pierre's petition reaches the king. As Jehan is reading it to him, the archdeacon rushes in and shares that Notre-Dame is being stormed by beggars who wish to remove Esmeralda from the cathedral. Jehan confesses that Esmeralda is innocent and that he is the real murderer, saying, "I did it, and I'd do it again." Jehan runs away, and the king orders him to be arrested. Clopin and his army of vagabonds approach Notre-Dame and demand the archbishop to give up Esmeralda under threat of having the church stormed. A cohort of middle-class craftsmen and citizens arrive, saying they've read Pierre's pamphlet and are ready to defend the sanctity of Notre-Dame against both the beggars and nobles. The priests, too, try to stop the vagabonds by fortifying the door. Up above, Quasimodo spots the army of people in front of the church and believes they are there to kill Esmeralda. He promises to defend her and tells her to ring one of the bells if she needs him. Quasimodo fights the vagabonds off by dropping boulders, wooden spires, and molten lead on them, crushing several people, including Clopin. As the vagabonds retreat, Quasimodo hears a bell ring and runs into the bell tower to find his father Jehan trying to kill Esmeralda. He lifts Jehan over his head and throws him off the cathedral to his death. As the sun rises, Gringoire announces that the king has pardoned Esmeralda and is allowing the Romani to live anywhere in France. Esmeralda leaves the cathedral and embraces her husband, and the two follow the crowd into the city streets to celebrate. Meanwhile, up in the bell tower, Quasimodo watches as Esmeralda is led away. He asks a statue, "Why was I not made of stone like thee?" And the credits roll. I love this ending. I love this ending, but I also hate this ending. And that's why I love this ending. Because just about everyone in this film gets their happy ending, right? The king's oppressive chief justice, Jehan, is killed. Pierre saves Esmeralda from execution. Esmeralda is free, and realizes that the man who has truly earned her affection is not Phoebus, but her husband, the guy who's been by her side the whole time. And the king overturns all these laws, barring the Romani from settling wherever they want to in the country, yada, yada, yada. They all live happily ever after, right? Oh, wait. Quasimodo is still alone. Because the king can write and rewrite laws, he can't change people's minds. He can't change the Parisians' opinions about Quasimodo. And that I interpreted as a reminder that progress doesn't always come from the top down. You know, sometimes progress requires a collective mindset change, which can be even harder than trying to appeal to our legislators to get laws passed and overturned. See, for example, Quasimodo, perhaps one of the most oppressed people in Paris, watching this beautiful celebration of justice and equality alone.
Maybe Frollo is right when he says public opinion is dangerous.
It can be dangerous if the public has an opinion that a person should be hurt or ostracized or have their individual autonomy stripped away.
This movie places a large emphasis on the theme of progress and the fight against what the film calls stupid superstition and prejudice. It's a very forward-thinking movie, and Gringoire is the ultimate example of that. In Hugo's novel, he's a buffoon. He's an ass. He is a pseudo-intellectual who thinks he is this great, well-informed man, but he really doesn't know anything. He's utterly ignorant of the role that he is playing in the story, and quite literally turns into a jester and a clown about halfway through. This Gringoire, though he starts off a little bit pompous like in the novel, is a man out of time. He is a freethinker. He's a little Thomas Paine. He's a little Voltaire. He's a little Victor Hugo, dare I say, promoting all sorts of causes that he finds would be helpful for the people. He champions equality, religious tolerance, and all sorts of things. And he champions the printing press, which has an important thematic role in Hugo's novel, but here it's actually incorporated into the plot.
I like that. I like that this movie shows rather than tells the importance of the printing press. You know, in Victor Hugo's original novel, he laments that the printing press has more or less made cathedrals obsolete because all of those statues and stained glass windows that you see in these architectural marvels were created to communicate stories from the Bible to a largely illiterate population. Now, with the printing press, more people are able to get books into their hands faster and cheaper. That means more people are going to learn how to read. You'll have this idea of universal literacy coming into play, which means we don't need beautiful cathedrals to tell us stories from the Bible. We can just read the Bible themselves, therefore making cathedrals obsolete. And Victor Hugo laments that. Ironically, he laments that through a printed book. But this movie heralds the printing press and universal literacy as the key to the human race achieving its true potential and arriving at a future where there truly is liberty and justice for all.
I attribute a lot of those progressive themes, and I'm using progressive in a general sense, not in terms of a contemporary political agreement.
Or the car insurance company.
Or the soup, if we want to add an O. I attribute that approach to the source material to the backgrounds of the people who wrote the story treatment and the screenplay. The story treatment was written by a guy named Bruno Frank, who was a German novelist, not exactly the Hollywood type. Frank wrote in a variety of genres, including historical novels. He wrote a historical novel in the early 30s, which has been translated as The Man Called Cervantes, which is about Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote, and the portrayal of Cervantes in that novel is a lot like Gringoire in this movie, where he is a man of the Enlightenment in a backwards, superstitious time. And I think Frank also drew on his background not just as a writer when creating his story adaptation, but on his background as a German and as a Jew. He moved to America in the early 30s not necessarily by choice, but because in his country he was quickly considered not human. He was an Untermenschen, a subhuman, by the Nazi government that was ruling Germany in the 1930s. And there is a lot of parallels between the political situation in Europe and, to a lesser extent, the United States in the 30s and this movie.
Yeah, this movie is all about Esmeralda's and Pierre Gringoire's fight to convince King Louis to grant the Romani people equal rights. At the beginning of this movie, we see a caravan of Romani stopped at the city gates and told, you can't enter the city without a permit because of your ethnicity. We don't want foreigners in our city. The same thing happened with many Jewish people in Germany and eventually beyond during the 1930s. They were told, we're not going to hire you, we're not going to sell you a home in this area, we're not going to allow you to vote. Oh, and we're not going to allow you to have any individual autonomy. And here, let's herd you into a concentration camp. I see many parallels in this film between the treatment of Romani people and the way Jewish people were treated in Germany in the 1930s. And I'm sure Mr. Frank understood that better than anyone.
And I agree that the portrayal of the Romani in this movie is influenced by the treatment of Jews in Nazi Germany. But let's not forget, the Nazis also greatly disfavored the Romani. They were considered Untermenschen as well.
Yeah, basically anyone who wasn't a white, blonde, blue-eyed German was considered subhuman by the Nazis.
Yeah, if you weren't a member of the Aryan race, the Nazis' ill-defined group that was supposed to be genetically superior, you were considered inferior and should be put up for extinction. That also included people with disabilities, such as Quasimodo, as he's portrayed in this movie.
Why is he called Quasimodo and not Quasimodo?
I think it's an effort on the part of the filmmakers to preserve a sense of Frenchness to this movie. In French, they don't pronounce Quasimodo as Quasimodo. They pronounce him as Quasimodo.
But if the filmmakers were trying to preserve the French pronunciation and be faithful to the source material, why call this movie The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the English title? Why not call it Notre-Dame de Paris or Notre-Dame of Paris or even Notre Dame?
Well, by 1939, the title The Hunchback of Notre Dame was the title for the story in the English-speaking world. Popular translations of Hugo's novel used that title, and especially the 1923 movie was called The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
And of course, that movie was a silent film. It didn't have sound. So how do we know whether Quasimodo in that movie was Quasimodo or Quasimodo? We don't.
I also see a large influence from the screenwriter, Sonya Levien. Like Frank, Levien was Jewish. She grew up relatively poor in the city of New York, back before high school was available to every person in the city.
Yeah, in doing research about Miss Levien myself, I learned that she was a pretty remarkable person. She grew up in a Jewish ghetto in New York City. She did not earn a high school diploma because there was no high school in her area. After she finished 8th grade, she went into the workforce and started working in a factory. She hated it, and through blood, sweat, and tears, she ended up climbing her way out. She ended up attending NYU Law School, which, listener, I went to NYU myself. There is absolutely no way that they would accept somebody who didn't have a high school diploma today, but it was a different time. She ended up editing for a magazine and working there with former US President Teddy Roosevelt, who took to calling her Little Miss Anarchist. And then she decided, you know what? I don't want to work for this magazine anymore. I want to try to make it as a Hollywood screenwriter. So she packed up her life and moved to California, and the rest is history.
You mentioned Little Miss Anarchist. That comes from Levien's political views, which were very influenced by her parents, who immigrated from the old world. Her father was something of an anarchist, very influenced by Peter Kropotkin and other thinkers who wanted to abolish the state and forms of government and go to a more collectivized, localized sense of organization. And she was also a bit sympathetic to kind of the opposite form of government, but still on the left side of the political spectrum, with the newly formed Soviet Union in the early 1920s after the Russian Revolution. I'm not aware of Levien's political views by the time this movie was made, but I do see a very strong political undercurrent to this movie. It's very critical of superstition and institutional oppression, but the movie is also critical of the new rise of authoritarianism throughout the 1930s and the Great Depression. There's obviously the comparison between the Nazi regime and the way that the Romani are treated in this movie. I also see a few parallels to Stalinist Russia and the rise of the Soviet Union and Marxism-Leninism, as the way the beggars are portrayed in this movie, with Pierre Gringoire and Esmeralda seen more as a moderating force.
Yes, they're the radical moderates. Oh no. I also see Clopin as an allegory for the way World War I veterans were treated during the Great Depression. As Quasimodo is being whipped, Pierre Gringoire and Clopin are standing off to the side, talking about how unfair everything is and how justice is long overdue, and Clopin reveals that he is a veteran of the 100 Years' War, and he says after the war ended, he and a bunch of other veterans came back home and started going door to door asking for honest work, and they were punished for begging. That sounds to me a lot like the way World War I veterans were treated during the Great Depression, when here is this whole generation of men who went off to war and came home with very severe mental and physical wounds from that experience fighting for their country. What do you mean they're all out of work? What do you mean they're all living in poverty and can't feed their kids in the country that they fought to defend?
Yeah, Clopin is talking about the 100 Years' War between England and France, but whenever the heck this movie is supposed to take place by the end of the 15th century.
Yeah, a specific year is not given. The book takes place during 1482. This movie just takes place during the end of the 15th century. So it could be set in 1482, or it could be set in 1492, or it could be set in 1475. No specific year is given.
The 100 Years' War had been over for a long time, so Clopin being a veteran is not impossible, but it stretches credibility. Like, how old is this guy?
He doesn't look that old. He looks like late 50s, maybe late 60s at the absolute most.
The idea of getting whipped for begging for work really reminds me of an incident from 1930, 1931 or so, called the Bonus Army Incident. Do you remember that from history class, Leslie?
Oh gosh, Pat, it's been so long. You're gonna be so disappointed in me. No, if I learned about this, I don't remember it. Please enlighten me, my dear.
Now, after the war, veterans were promised a bonus, a cash payment of a certain amount that would be paid out after a certain number of years after the war had ended. Might have been like 20 years in the future, something like that. But the Great Depression was so hard that veterans organized to try to convince the government to give out the bonus early. And so the people marched onto Washington, they peacefully protested, and President Herbert Hoover sent out the military and the National Guard to break up the protests and shoot at American veterans. It was a disaster.
Herbert Hoover, probably one of the worst presidents the U.S. ever had.
There's a reason why he lost to Franklin D. Roosevelt. When your response to people dealing with the Great Depression is to shoot veterans in the face and beat them up in the streets, that's a terrible look.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm stretching, but the way that they're talking about, back with the war, I just see it as a big allegory for the political situation at the time.
This whole movie is about the state of the world during the 1930s. It's about the way veterans were treated post-World War I, sure. It's also about the way Jewish people and anyone the Nazis deemed subhuman or of inferior genetics were treated in Germany and beyond as the Holocaust was beginning. It's also about the Great Depression in general.
A lot of these aspects of 1930s America and Europe are represented in the class politics of this movie, which Like in the novel, there's a distinct role for social class, and the 1923 movie emphasizes that as the aristocrats versus the beggars. This movie has a similar class dynamic, but it's a lot more developed. It's less black and white. You have the nobles versus the beggars, but there's also a role for the monarchy and for the middle class, the church, and the new class of freethinkers and intellectuals, such as Pierre Gringoire in this movie.
Yeah, it's not just Group A versus Group B, as in Universal's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. It's Group A versus Group B versus Group C versus Group D.
Louis XI is a bit in the middle. You know, he's still an all-powerful monarch, but he's concerned about the power of the nobility being greater than his own, which is actually historically accurate. And Louis XI is a bit of an enlightened despot in this movie. You know, he'll read these pamphlets and consider some of these new ideas like the printing press, but he will also believe in things like trial by ordeal, which was a real thing in the Middle Ages, and will be appalled at the notion that he will have to bathe twice a year if he wishes to live longer.
Which is different from the way King Louis XI is portrayed in Victor Hugo's original novel. In that book, he is a very cruel, callous man who enjoys spending money on new ways to torture people, such as buying cages that are too low and too narrow for prisoners to be comfortable in. And he likens himself very down to earth and very humble. He says, "Oh no, I'm not going to be frivolous with my money like previous kings were. I'm not going to sleep in my grand ornate palace. That's way too ostentatious for me. Instead, I am going to have an apartment built in the Bastille, a political prison, and I'm going to sleep there instead because I am a humble, down-to-earth king."
With no chairs.
Yeah, in the book, he's too cheap to buy chairs for his apartment, so when his friends come over and hang out with him, they have to stand all night because there's nowhere for them to sit down.
Yeah, King Louis XI would not be a fan of Aldi.
No, he wouldn't. And in Universal's movie, we see King Louis XI very briefly, and he is described as maybe even more tyrannical than King Louis XI from the book. He's described as very cold and callous and the driving force behind the oppression of the beggars. This King Louis XI in RKO is a little more open-minded. He's not completely there yet. He does have some learning to do and some progress to make. Like you said, Patrick, he is appalled that he has to shower 2 times a year and not once a year or once every other year. But he does say things like, "Who cares about her race? She's pretty." Can you imagine that line featuring in a film released the same year Hitler invaded Poland? That's a pretty startlingly progressive line, especially to come from a character who is, I'll just say it, an older white man.
And I'm not saying this is exactly what the filmmakers intended, but I think my interpretation is a bit valid. Is Louis XI Franklin Roosevelt, Claude Frollo is Adolf Hitler, and Clopin is Stalin or just maybe some kind of Bolshevik revolutionary?
What would that make Pierre Gringoire?
Sonya Levien.
Ah, there we go. Yeah, let's talk about Pierre Gringoire, because like you said earlier, Patrick, Victor Hugo's Pierre Gringoire is a bumbling idiot. He likens himself this noble, crusading intellectual, but really, he's just a dumb, selfish jerk.
He's a booby.
He is a booby. He writes this play that's performed at the Festival of Fools. It's too complicated. Nobody understands what it's about. He gets married. He is almost hanged in the Court of Miracles. Esmeralda comes forward and offers to marry him to save his life, and he feels absolutely no loyalty toward her in return. He keeps forgetting that he has a wife. He keeps forgetting that he is a character in a Victor Hugo novel. He keeps leaving the story and running into characters every 100 or so pages and saying, Oh, you. I remember you. How's my wife? I don't know. She's somewhere. He is solely interested in his own self-preservation. He is a completely selfish individual, which makes it so frustrating that he is one of only a couple of characters who survives the book. But RKO's Pierre Gringoire is my favorite Pierre Gringoire because it takes everything that I hated about Gringoire's character and fixes it. In this movie, he is an intellectual. He is a very smart, clever person. He has a doctorate. He introduces himself as Pierre Gringoire, Doctor of the 7 Liberal Arts. Patrick, what are the 7 liberal arts?
Before, liberal arts were these gen eds that you had to get out of the way, and hopefully a few AP credits would take care of them when you went to college. The liberal arts in the Middle Ages were actually cool. They were separated into 2 sections, the trivium and the quadrivium. 3 plus 4 equals 7. The trivium and the quadrivium, that sort of classical medieval education, that was no joke. So I don't know where Gringoire got his doctorate from, maybe the University of Paris, but he's a serious guy. And Pierre Gringoire is a man out of time. He is a forward-thinking intellectual. He values reason rather than stupid superstition and prejudice.
Like I said, in Victor Hugo's novel, Pierre forgets about his wife after a little while. He doesn't care to repay his debt to the woman who saved his life. But in RKO's movie, when Pierre Gringoire tells Esmeralda, I love you and I am willing to be whatever you want me to be, a husband, a brother, a friend, he means it. He goes out of his way to take care of Esmeralda, even after he knows that she is in love with another man. He visits her in prison. He writes an appeal to the king to get her pardoned, and it works. When she is being led to her execution, the guards have to peel Pierre off of her because he will not let her go. And as the noose is being tied around her neck, Pierre puts his head on Clopin's shoulder and bursts into tears. But when Quasimodo rescues Esmeralda, they become tears of joy. And over time, Esmeralda grows to reciprocate Pierre's feelings. Initially, she only married him to save his life and didn't really feel any affection for him. But over time, as she notices that he cares about her, he is an intellectual, he is invested in social justice, he is committed to helping her and freeing her and her people, she starts to love him. I really like Esmeralda and Pierre's relationship in this movie.
And I really like Esmeralda herself. She's a much more active character than she was in Victor Hugo's book. And just like with the themes of the printing press, where we're doing a lot more showing rather than telling, here we see events that are only mentioned briefly in the book, such as Esmeralda and the Romani entering the gates of Paris.
In the book, Esmeralda says that she came to Paris with a caravan a couple of years ago. Here, we actually see her arriving at the Paris gates, being told you can't come in because you're Romani, and sneaking past the guard. Esmeralda in this movie is technically what we would conceive of today as an illegal immigrant.
She's an action hero.
Absolutely. She's running around Paris. She's fighting for social justice. She's a badass woman in this movie.
No, and when she gets kidnapped by Quasimodo, as in the novel, it's not that she gets run down in an alleyway. She runs all over the city. She makes poor Charles Laughton get his steps in.
Can I tell you a story from Maureen O'Hara's memoir?
Oh, please do.
Patrick, you mentioned that Maureen O'Hara and Charles Laughton met on the set of this Alfred Hitchcock movie called Jamaica Inn. Well, there was a production associate also working on the set of Jamaica Inn named George Brown. He was 26, Maureen was 18. And Brown had a crush on Maureen O'Hara. I don't blame him. She is a beautiful woman. And he asked her on a couple of dates. They ended up going on 2 dates. She didn't really like him that much. She wasn't interested in him. But He was one of those people who do not know how to take no for an answer. And the day she and her mother were supposed to leave Ireland to go to the United States to start shooting The Hunchback of Notre Dame, George Brown called her apartment building every 5 minutes. And the phone is ringing and ringing and ringing off the hook. And of course, there was no caller ID back then. You know, one of the calls might have been from someone associated with RKO calling to share some information about the Hunchback of Notre Dame. So, of course, because she is a consummate professional, she picks up the phone every time it rings, and it's always this George Brown guy who she really doesn't know anything about, telling her, I love you, please come to my house and see me, we're meant to be together, just harassing this poor girl. And eventually she decides to go to his house just to get the incessant phone calls to stop and to hopefully convince him in person, hey, I'm not interested in you, leave me alone. She gets to his house, there's a priest there. She goes, what the heck is going on? He goes, oh, we're going to get married. And he coerces her into marrying him on the spot. And to make matters worse, he lies to the priest about her age. She was 18. He told the priest she was over 21 years old. So here's poor little Maureen O'Hara, only 18 years old, sailing away to the United States to kick off her career in Hollywood. This is supposed to be one of the most exciting days of her life. She's supposed to be spending this time focusing on the role in this upcoming movie she's going to be in. And instead, she is near to tears, freaking out about the fact that she was just forced to marry this guy she knows nothing about. Eventually, the marriage was annulled, but oh my gosh, this wasn't even 90 years ago when this was happening.
Forced proximity trope?
No. We've got a little forced proximity trope happening between Quasimodo and Esmeralda in this movie.
Laughton's portrayal of Quasimodo is very sensitive, often imitated but never duplicated. And I think it's because he brings his personal pathos to the character. Unlike Lon Chaney, Charles Laughton was very much a method actor, to the point where he wanted to physically be in pain and suffer in the role, which I find a little ridiculous. But it's that emotional pain that he understands what it's like to be an outcast and to feel hideous in your own body and ugly compared to people around you who you find beautiful and much better than yourself in terms of their kindness and beauty and generosity. There used to be a YouTube re-upload of the scene of Quasimodo and Esmeralda in the bell tower, where Quasimodo tells Esmeralda, I never realized till now how ugly I am because you are so beautiful. And that re-upload was called, in all caps, Charles Laughton is God. I'm inclined to agree. It is a masterful performance that really should have won an Academy Award. It is often imitated, never duplicated, an absolute masterpiece of a scene. And the little scene afterwards, which is not from Hugo's novel, is brilliant, where Quasimodo shows Esmeralda around the bell tower and plays the bells for her in a childish, delighted way, only to have her alarmed by the volume of the bells. That is inspired by bits and pieces from the book, as are so many of the changes in this adaptation. They're not just changes that are made willy-nilly. They are changes that are often informed from the novel and have a seed from the novel. Hugo describes Quasimodo naming the bells and being affectionate towards them and even swinging and riding on the bells as if he's riding a horse. That's described beautifully by Hugo, but in the film we actually see it and incorporate it into the story, where Quasimodo leaps onto a bell to make noise and sing for Esmeralda. And I say often imitated and never duplicated. That's not just with Laughton's performance as Quasimodo, which is very sensitive and absolutely marvelous. The makeup effects are also brilliant. I know there was a lot of conflict between Charles Laughton and the makeup man, Perce Westmore, in figuring out what the design for Quasimodo would be. There were many tests and fights behind the scenes. But The result is absolutely breathtaking. Quasimodo looks like a real person.
Oh my gosh, during the whipping scene where Quasimodo's tunic is torn open and his back is exposed, the hump is seamless. It looks like it's part of his body. When I was watching this movie the other night in preparation to record this episode, I found myself staring at that makeup job in awe with my jaw dropped to the floor, even though I've seen this movie many, many times before. I mean, it's in my Letterboxd top 4. Every time I see that makeup, I am in awe.
It rivals anything by Jack Pierce, any other big makeup effects character of that era, any of the characters from Wizard of Oz or Frankenstein or the Wolfman. Perce Westmore's Quasimodo is up there, and the scene where Quasimodo is showing the bells to Esmeralda, which is not in the book. In the book, Quasimodo loses interest in the bells after Esmeralda gives him water. His affection for the bells is replaced by an affection for Esmeralda. I like real girls now. This is an element expanded from the Lon Chaney movie where Quasimodo rings the bells out of wild joy for Esmeralda being present. Having Quasimodo actually show Esmeralda the bells is a scene that ends up in just about every future adaptation that I can think of. It's in the 1956 French film, it's in a few of the TV versions, it even ends up in the Disney cartoon.
That's Little Sophia, and Jean Marie, Anne Marie, Louise Marie. I like how in RKO's movie, Quasimodo does not refer to the bells as his girlfriends or his harem, as Victor Hugo does in the original novel. He refers to the bells as his babies. Like, he's his dad, and they're his little children he takes care of. And when he's introducing the bells to Esmeralda, he sings their names in the notes that they play. I think that's so clever. That's such a great acting choice from Charles Laughton. Of course he's going to sing the names of the bells because that is how they communicate with him. That is how he understands them.
I love all of the little choices where he kicks the bells with his feet and swings them with his arms. He hardly ever uses the bell rope. It's such a joyous and playful attitude that is something that's from Hugo's novel, just in a new cinematic way.
I want to talk about Sir Cedric Hardwicke's Frollo. This is the Claude Frollo who we know from the book, but just like in Universal's Hunchback adaptation, the character Claude Frollo is split into two characters. The religious aspects of the character, namely him being the Archdeacon of Notre Dame, is given to a separate character who is the older brother of the second character, Jehan Frollo, who performs all of the actions that Claude Frollo does in the book. He is lusting after and pursuing Esmeralda. He stabs Captain Phoebus and pins it on Esmeralda in an attempt to get her executed. Although in Victor Hugo's original novel, Frollo does not successfully murder Phoebus. Phoebus survives that book. In this movie, Frollo is successful in stabbing the captain. Captain Phoebus dies in this movie. So we have Jehan's older brother, the Archdeacon, who represents God's goodness and sense of justice and compassion. And then we have his younger brother, Jehan Frollo. He is not the same Jehan Frollo from Victor Hugo's novel. In Victor Hugo's novel, the character named Jehan Frollo is a teenager. He's a college student. He doesn't really care much about anything besides hooking up with pretty girls and drinking lots of beer. YOLO swag forever. He's a frat boy. In this movie, Jehan Frollo is essentially the character Claude Frollo from the book, just without being the Archdeacon of Notre Dame, and without being an alchemist. In the book, Frollo teaches alchemy to a whole bunch of nobles on the side. Here, Frollo is the king's chief justice, and he would never indulge in the black arts like alchemy. He's very, very straight-laced.
I want to mention that during the 1930s, there was a formal censorship code in place in Hollywood. So even if they wanted to portray Frollo as a villainous priest, as in the novel, they really couldn't. One of the components of the Hays Code was that you could not portray clergy in a negative light. Even so, I think that this movie plays around with the Hays Code and the censorship regime at the time. Esmeralda regards Frollo when they first meet, and she says, "Who are you? You're not a priest, and yet you look like one." And Frollo replies, "I am what I wish to be."
Even though he's not a member of the clergy like his brother, he is a religious figure. I mean, when Jehan comes to his older brother, the archdeacon, and says, "I have killed a man out of love for a woman who has bewitched me," both characters quote the Bible in order to justify their stances.
Claude says that he that smiteth a man so that he shall die shall be surely put to death. And Jehan replies, but God also said, I will appoint a place where there he shall flee. You gotta protect me, bro. Unlike the 1923 movie, the portrayal of religion in this movie is not totally black and white. Yes, the church is portrayed positively for the most part, as is religion itself. Esmeralda becomes a Christian in this adaptation.
Yeah, she prays to the Virgin Mary for the first time in her life in a scene that never fails to make me tear up no matter how many times I watch this movie. And by the way, that scene where Esmeralda takes sanctuary in Notre Dame after she flees from the guards asking to see her city papers, aka her citizenship papers, that scene is borrowed in the Disney movie during the God Help the Outcasts sequence, when we see all the parishioners praying only for themselves, and then we cut to Esmeralda singing, I ask for nothing, I can get by, but I have so many less lucky than I. That does not appear in Victor Hugo's novel. Esmeralda is not interested in social justice at all in Victor Hugo's novel. Her big goal, instead, is to be reunited with her long-lost parents.
Esmeralda does pray to the Christian God in the novel, but it's really only out of desperation and fear towards the end of the story.
Yeah, she doesn't recognize her friends who are storming Notre Dame to liberate her from the cathedral and bring her home, and she prays to the Christian God for the very first time to protect her. Whereas in the 1939 movie, Esmeralda prays for her people to be liberated from oppression, saying, take my life, take all I have, but please help my people. You know, I ask for nothing, I can get by, but I have so many less lucky than I. And there are quite a few scenes and shots in the Disney movie that are borrowed almost directly from RKO's 1939 movie. But we'll get to that when we get to the Disney movie in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, Ted Turner, who owned the copyright to the 1939 movie in the 1990s, he should have sued. This movie has a largely positive portrayal of Christianity and religion, but it does not shy away from the danger of hypocrisy and superstition as embodied by Jehan Frollo and the aristocracy and especially the legal system.
Yeah, when Jehan confronts Esmeralda in the cathedral, saying, you're a witch, you're a heathen, you come from an evil race, Esmeralda says something to the effect of, if my people really did have the power of witchcraft on our side, wouldn't we use it to lift ourselves out of poverty? Wouldn't we use it for our own gain? And Jehan, even though he's having his hypocrisy called out plain as day, doesn't even entertain the argument.
Nope. He just says that Esmeralda's people should be destroyed by fire and sword, which is a paraphrase of actual orders that have been given against the Romani throughout the Middle Ages and early modern period.
I do really enjoy that scene, though, because the two strike up, not a conversation necessarily, but Esmeralda does wear Claude Frollo down by talking about her love of animals. And of course, as she's talking about this, she's looking at the Virgin Mary, and Jehan is staring at her rack. And every time she looks back at him, his eyes shoot from her chest back to hers. Very funny. But he reveals that he loves animals too. And we see this whenever Jehan ducks into his office. There are cats everywhere, which makes me wonder, how does he get away with wearing black so often? He must be covered in cat hair from head to toe.
I wonder if he considers Quasimodo an animal, like one of his cats.
Oh, that's interesting. He probably does.
Quasimodo is kind of a cat. They're both loners who like jumping around.
Does Jehan talk to Quasimodo in this movie or communicate with him outside of a couple facial expressions and a hand gesture? I mean, during the scene where Jehan orders Quasimodo to chase after and abduct Esmeralda, Jehan doesn't say anything. He just gives Quasimodo one single hand signal, and Quasimodo knows that that means chase after this person and abduct them, which tells me this can't have been pre-planned, right? Because Esmeralda just came to Paris that day. Jehan Frollo has only just seen her. So this scene makes me wonder, how many other people has Jehan forced Quasimodo to kidnap? If he already knows one hand signal means grab this person for me, surely there were others, right?
Maybe. Quasimodo is terrified of Frollo in this version. All Sir Cedric Hardwicke needs to do is give Quasimodo a stare, and Quasimodo will stop whatever he's doing. There's a scene where Quasimodo is madly ringing the bells out of affection for Esmeralda. All the priests in Notre-Dame and the archbishop and the archdeacon cannot stop Quasimodo from ringing out at the wrong time. All Frollo has to do is give a single look to Quasimodo. And the filmmakers do a great job with portraying Frollo's dramatic eyes, which are an important part of his character in the novel. Frollo is such a creepy, leering character, yet his eyes in the novel are the only part of him that seem youthful. His hair is almost completely gone, except for a few ugly gray tufts, and otherwise his expression is very weathered and severe. But those eyes are the only glowing, youthful part of him. And Sir Cedric Hardwicke does an amazing job with refraining from blinking. Whenever he's going on some maniacal rant about how Esmeralda is a witch and must die, he never blinks. For as many differences as there are in this adaptation, I don't know if there's another adaptation that gets Frollo as a frightening, creepy character with those crazy eyes the way that this version does.
He's almost like a cat himself, in that his eyes move first and then he moves. Maybe he has taken on the mannerisms of those cats that he loves so much.
He likes those cats better than Quasimodo.
He likes those cats better than most human beings.
No, you're right. In the opening scene, Frollo tells the king that he should hang the operator of the printing press when that guy is like 5 feet away.
That's a scene straight from the Disney Channel. You need to hang the printer. He's right behind me, isn't he? Except Jehan knows the printer's right behind him and doesn't care. Oh, Your Majesty, you should hang that guy. And of course, the king, because he is a more benevolent old man who doesn't take anything too seriously, is like, ha ha, Jehan, you're so funny.
Sire, we must break the press and hang the printer, for between them they will destroy our old and holy order.
And there is a scene, and it's a very brief scene, I didn't mention it in the plot synopsis, where Jehan orders a printing press to be destroyed by the guards.
And the printing press was metaphorically and kind of literally destroyed in regimes like Nazi Germany. Freedom of expression was severely limited unless you were saying what the party line wanted. They had book burnings, for goodness sakes. Frollo is also concerned about the foreign race overrunning all of Europe. Frollo in the novel wishes he had the power and efficacy of Frollo in this version. In the novel, Frollo writes petitions to ban the Romani from Paris, but here, those laws are actually in place and enforced. At some point, Frollo is able to round up all of the Romani women in Paris, just so he can inspect them and see, all right, did they find Esmeralda so I can have her for myself? He's using government power to bring Esmeralda into his midst. And he doesn't even have to do the elaborate roundabout conspiracy like he does in the novel, where Frollo blames Esmeralda for Phoebus's murder and then helps use his friendship and connections in the law to bring Esmeralda to his hands.
Which I think makes this Frollo look even more desperate. That he is in this huge position of power even outside of the church. He is able to bring Esmeralda to him with just a flick of his wrist, and yet she keeps evading him. I think that makes this Frollo look even more obsessive and neurotic. Oh my gosh, I am one of the most powerful people in the country. I am the king's high justice. I should be able to snap my fingers and have this woman in my lap in 2 seconds. Why does she keep evading me? It's a very interesting dynamic.
Well, that's another influence on the Disney movie. In this adaptation, Frollo is a judge. He's the Chief Justice. That's more or less the same role that Frollo has in the Disney animated film.
And that's a change that originated in the first opera adapted from The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Louis Bertin's La Esmeralda, in which the character Frollo was supposed to be a priest, but the French government censorship committee said, hey, you can't have the antagonist of your opera, which is being performed at a government-funded opera house, in the role of a clergyman. That's not okay. So that character was changed to an alderman or a magistrate, someone who still has a position of authority just in the judicial system rather than in the church. And we see that change made in several other adaptations. We see it made in this movie, RKO's movie. We see it made many decades later in the Disney movie. You know what I like about this screenplay? I like that it fills in some little plot holes from Victor Hugo's novel without feeling overwritten. For example, in Victor Hugo's novel, this play is being performed at the Festival of Fools, written by Pierre Gringoire, and then Clopin starts interrupting the play by begging for money. Why is Clopin interrupting the play? Why is he begging for money at this particular moment? Well, RKO's movie answers that. At some point, Clopin looks up and says, oh, all these people are watching the play, which means they're not watching us and giving us money. So, he hijacks the play. In Victor Hugo's novel, Esmeralda is present at Quasimodo's whipping for some reason. Here, the movie answers that question. Pierre Gringoire is present, trying to appeal to the archdeacon to stop the brutal punishment. Esmeralda finds him and says, oh, I told my people that the king is considering helping us, and then sees Quasimodo. In Victor Hugo's novel, Esmeralda shares that she came to Paris a few years ago with a caravan of her people. Why did she do that? Why Paris? Why not any other city in Europe? Well, this movie answers that. She comes to Paris to appeal to the king and try to get her people equal rights. It's filling in those little plot holes without feeling heavy-handed. You know, that's a criticism that I have of movies like Disney's live-action Beauty and the Beast, starring Emma Watson, where it goes out of its way to answer questions that nobody really had, and if they did, they were speculating amongst themselves on Tumblr. Oh, why didn't anyone remember the castle staff? Oh, that's weird. I don't think we needed that question answered in that movie. I think the fact that Disney went out of its way to answer it in the remake of the movie just proves that they're a little self-conscious about what people on the internet might say about their films. So RKO's Hunchback fills in little plot holes very naturally and organically, showing rather than telling, without being heavy-handed or feeling self-conscious or anxious.
It's a very confident movie.
Absolutely. There's a lot of showing rather than telling. For example, when Quasimodo is preparing to fight back the vagabonds who he thinks are trying to storm the cathedral to kill Esmeralda, he's not running around the bell tower mumbling to himself saying, "Oh no, what do? I have to save Esmeralda, but I don't know how." Because he doesn't have to. Charles Laughton is such a good physical actor that we can see that fear and confusion and conflict on Quasimodo's face and in Quasimodo's body, and we as the viewer can extrapolate that that is what he's thinking. You know, this is a movie that trusts its viewers' intelligence. It shows and it doesn't tell. Pat, I reached out to a couple of our listeners on social media and I said, hey, the next adaptation we're covering is RKO's 1939 movie. Are there any bits of trivia you think I should include in my notes? And just about all of them said, oh, you should include the fact that this film's sound technicians went to Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris and recorded the bells to include in the movie. And I replied, yes, they did, and then they got back to America and realized the actual bells of Notre Dame didn't sound that great, so they recorded the bells at a random local church and used those instead. So, there you go.
I'm reminded of that episode of The Simpsons where a film production comes to Springfield and the kids are confused as to why some of the filmmakers are painting horses white with black spots. The kids ask what's going on, and the filmmakers explain that they're painting the horses to look like cows, because cows don't look like cows on film. You gotta use horses. Well, what do you use if you want to show a horse? I don't know. Usually you just tape a bunch of cats together. We got the real bells of Notre Dame in this movie. Yeah, but they don't sound like the bells of Notre Dame as we imagine them in our hearts. Find something better.
We got the bells of Notre Dame at home. All right, Pat, we have arrived at the end of our episode about RKO's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, released in 1939. But before we part, what are your overall thoughts on this particular film?
I love this movie. I could almost quote it word for word from the beginning.
I would be very surprised if you couldn't.
Let's go on a long road trip. Let's see what happens.
All right, listener, I'll update you.
This is a brilliantly made film in just about every aspect. The editing is terrific. This is fast-paced and engaging. The special effects and set design are world-class. This is the Hollywood studio system at its peak, doing the best that it could do, which was be efficient and get a lot of people moving and a lot of parts in motion. The cast is stacked and all give fantastic performances. This is a career-defining performance for Charles Laughton, a career-defining performance for Maureen O'Hara, and career highlights for Thomas Mitchell, Sir Cedric Hardwicke, and Edmund O'Brien, who is unrecognizable in this movie. He's most famous for being kind of schlubby and in gangster movies. I think he was in the first movie version in 1984. All excellent performances. On the back of the box of the DVD, it says that this is one of the best examples of Hollywood expertise at work. I agree. And Maureen O'Hara, years later reflecting on this movie, said, "It's the best Hunchback that was ever made. It's the finest portrayal by anybody of Quasimodo," and that she was very proud to have been part of it. And I'm inclined to agree. We'll go through all of the adaptations that we can find throughout this podcast and this little creative adventure, and I hope that there are new adaptations that are even better, but it's going to be very difficult to top this movie. This is a masterpiece, and it's up there with Hugo's novel for me. I adore this movie. It really is one of the finest that has ever been made in film history. Now, Leslie, could you possibly praise this movie any more than me?
I completely agree with Miss O'Hara. This is the best Hunchback that was ever made. This is one of those very rare book-to-film adaptations where the movie is better than the book. And I am saying that as someone who considers Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame to be my favorite novel of all time. This movie redeems Pierre Gringoire, a character I absolutely despised in the book. It fills in just about all of the book's plot holes without feeling overwritten. And it argues for the book's themes better than the book itself does. Those themes being the triumph of intellectualism and modernity over medievalism and brutishness. Every single one of the actors in this film gives a career best performance. I am heartbroken that this film wasn't at least nominated for Best Picture.
This movie only got 2 Oscar nominations for Best Sound and Best Score. Nothing for directing, nothing for Best Picture, nothing for acting. I know it was a stacked year in 1939. Still, this movie is that good.
I think it is a crime against humanity that this film did not get at least a nomination for Best Picture. It's a crime against humanity that Charles Laughton didn't get at least a nomination for Best Actor. And of course, there was no Oscar for Best Makeup at this time, unfortunately. The Oscar for Best Makeup wasn't introduced until after David Lynch's The Elephant Man was released in theaters. But I digress. Listener, if you have never seen this movie, please, 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 I will sell you my firstborn if only you agree to give it a chance. You will be amazed. Which brings us to the game we like to play at the end of every episode. Patrick, out of everyone and everything we discussed in this episode of the Hunchcast, who or what would you A, meet at the inn, B, turn to dust with, and C, throw off of Notre Dame?
I will be meeting Sonya Levien at the inn, because how on earth do you go to NYU Law School with no high school diploma? Sounds like a lot easier of a time. So Sonya, what is your secret? We'll get a drink, we'll get a room, we'll figure it out. Now I'll be turning to dust with Charles Laughton, not just because this performance is one of the best, but because Charles Laughton is one of the best. Maybe not one of the best people, he could often be very cruel and arrogant, but his pathos and his genius and love of beauty really are remarkable. I love Laughton so much that I did a book report about a biography of him when I was in the 9th grade. Laughton's performance in this movie is so wonderful that it introduced me to so many wonderful films that he starred in. Mutiny on the Bounty, The Island of Lost Souls, The Old Dark House, The Private Life of Henry VIII. He even played Rembrandt once upon a time. Laughton is one of my favorite actors. He's certainly not your conventional Hollywood type, being not conventionally attractive and overweight, but he is so brilliant and so wonderful and has this love of beauty about him, even if it is mixed with his own self-loathing and misery, that it breaks my heart just to think about him. So I will be turning to dust with the one and only Charles Laughton. As for who I'll be throwing off of Notre Dame, it's not anybody in this movie, it's not anybody who made this movie. I will be throwing the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, every last voting member, off of Notre Dame, and I hope they impale themselves with their Golden Academy Award statues as they land. This movie was absolutely snubbed at the 1940 Academy Awards, and heads need to roll for that crime against humanity, Leslie.
Yeah, shove your little gold statues up your butt, people.
Now, Leslie, are we in agreement, or do you have your own take?
Oh, I always have my own take. I am an individual.
Ah, a freethinker like Gringoire.
I try to be. I am going to meet Edmund O'Brien at the inn. Not only is he a beautiful, beautiful man, very nice to look at in this movie, but he brings a sort of intensity and earnestness and compassion to Pierre Gringoire that is completely absent from the character in Victor Hugo's original novel. I love what he brings to the role. I love that he, along with the brilliant writing of Sonya Levien, totally redeem this character and make him one of my favorite characters in any Hunchback adaptation. So I'm gonna meet Mr. O'Brien at the inn. And he and Maureen O'Hara met each other at the inn quite a few times after this movie was made. Not in a romantic context, I don't believe they ever dated, but the two of them remained friends for a very, very long time after this movie finished shooting. Even though they never worked together again, they made an effort to stay in each other's lives, which I think is very sweet. I will be turning to dust with showing and not telling. Listener, I am an editor. That's my career. That's how I pay the bills. My editing philosophy when it comes to fiction is showing rather than telling. Trust the reader's intelligence. You don't need to hold their hand and spoon feed them. Trust that they weren't born yesterday and they can extrapolate what's going on without you having to over-explain, as in these second screen movies that are being released on Netflix nowadays. I think this movie is a great example of showing rather than telling. There are quite a few scenes that do not have any dialogue at all, or if they do, very little dialogue. And yet, we as the audience know exactly what's going on. We know exactly what the characters are thinking and feeling just based on their expressions and the context of the scene. That is the mark of a great writer. Sonya Levien, I hope you got your flowers eventually. I can't believe you were snubbed for an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay, so I'm turning to dust with showing rather than telling. And this might get me in a bit of trouble with our listeners. I'm going to throw the bells of Notre Dame off of Notre Dame. Get your act together, guys. How far you have fallen from your former glory. Say that 10 times fast. What do you mean you didn't even sound good enough to be featured in a movie about the bells of Notre Dame and that the sound technicians at RKO had to go to a random local church? Come on, guys, get it together or I'm tilting you off of the facade.
Well, whatever we got next episode, Leslie, has some pretty big shoes to fill.
Does it sing the bells, 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 bells of Notre Dame?
Well, I suppose we'll find out.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hunchcast. Ring that notification bell to be automatically updated when new episodes are released. If you liked this episode, please take a moment to give this podcast a 5-star rating or review. It really helps our show get in front of new people. For free bonus content and to share your thoughts with us, follow us on Instagram, Tumblr, and TikTok at The Hunchcast. The Hunchcast of Notre Dame is a production of 1482 Media. All rights reserved.